Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome back to another exciting episode of the World Builder's Anvil. Today, I would like to talk about wonders of your fantasy world. And you might wonder why I keep talking about wonders of the world over and over. This is probably the third episode now I've talked about wonders of the world at least. And it's actually quite simple. I keep coming back to wonders of the world because they stick out to the cultures. If you have immense structures or geographical features of your world, it's going to stick out. It's going to have a huge impact on the cultures and the people in the world. So let's get into what I talk about when I talk about wonders, because it's not all going to be exactly what you think. However, most of it really is going to be. So let's start off with some natural wonders of Earth. You have Mount Fuji, which is this immense mountain. And I like using Mount Fuji because it really sticks out in comparison to something like Mount Everest, which is a larger mountain, but it's tucked into the Himalayas, which is a gigantic mountain range. Mount Fuji rises up out of the plains of Japan. It's this immense, important mountain in their culture because of it. It might not really be a wonder in the scope of the whole world today, but definitely for a long time, and especially to the Japanese culture, it is a wonder. The Great Barrier Reef. It is this immense life form that lives in the ocean off of Australia, in the South Pacific. It will have all sorts of teeming life. It is a barrier versus deep bottom ships, which will make it harder for what we think about, especially in Western cultures, as ocean-going vessels. Now, your Polynesians and the types of ocean-going ships they use might be able to sail right across most of it, but it's still noticeable. There's still a huge attraction of life to it. And because of that, all of the cultures that have lived around there have been greatly impacted by the Great Barrier Reef. So it's, once again, a wonder of the world. The Aurora Borealis. It's not a physical wonder, and it's not something that's even always there. It's these lights that pop up in the northern hemisphere that you can see, and it's essentially particles interacting with the atmosphere. It makes very pretty lights. It's quite noticeable the farther north you go, and there's also, I believe that they're called Aurora Australis in the southern hemisphere, which I believe are relatively the same phenomena, but it's these lights that appear to be glowing through the sky, and where in and of themselves they're not something tangible or physical like the Great Barrier Reef or Mount Fuji. They still have a huge impact on the world because it's these lights that glow at night. Depending on where you live, you might see them some nights and not on other nights. So it's something that sticks out massively that's going to impact at least one culture, if not multiple cultures, or people who visit areas who see it for the first time might have their breaths taken away by this immense light display in the sky that is probably relatively unexplainable, especially early on in cultures. Later on, they might be able to explain them, but it's still an amazement today. However, when you start getting to a world that has more light pollution, something like an Aurora Borealis is going to become less significant because it's going to be harder to see. Maybe, and I don't know if this is true, but maybe back in the 1600s, you could see the Aurora Borealis where New York City is today. But there's so much light, you might not even be able to notice it if it's there in the evening. The Great Rift Valley might be a wonder of the world, and it's definitely impactful. The one flaw with a wonder as large as the Great Rift Valley in Africa is it's probably too big in most areas, and you might not even think of it as one geological feature. You might think of it as multiple geological features. But essentially, the Great Rift Valley is where two tectonic plates are ripping part of Africa, the arm of Africa, off, and it's trying to push it up the Indian Ocean away from what we consider the rest of Africa. And because of that, you get this giant canyon being ripped out by the forces of the tectonic plates moving on Earth. Now, a better one really, I think, for a wonder would be something like the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon is something that you can see. It sticks out as one feature, essentially where the river has cut so deeply into the earth that it's left huge walls that rise up. I've actually never gone to the the Grand Canyon. However, it's something I always wanted to see because it's just this immense pit in the earth that has been cut out over who knows millions and millions of years. And it's left a huge impact on the cultures who grew up around there, because not only does it block your travel, it's something you have to explain as a culture early on. And even today, when you view something like that and you understand how it formed, it's still amazing to see these wonders up close. And when you can tell it's this one feature, because it's not huge like the Great Rift Valley, it's going to have a huge impact on the culture and be considered this entity to a culture. Now, not all wonders are natural. There are some that are man-made, and there are many things that we could pick for this. Some of the really tall towers that exist today, especially early on when you have the Sears Tower, or you have the Eiffel Tower in Paris, you have the Empire State Building. Those were wonders of their time, and they might not be anymore, even though I'm still really impressed when I see a really tall building. But that could just be me. But when we're talking about a wonder, it really has to impact an entire culture and be this important thing that means essentially the same thing to everyone who shares the cultural belief. When other cultures come there, they need to have the same impact for it. And one of the things to keep in mind are these wonders are going to be changing over time. And I'll get back to more of that in a minute. But now let's talk about some other ones. Some ones I think that are still recognized from the ancient world. You have the Great Wall of China, this immense wall that was built up to help protect what the Chinese considered the main part of China from the barbarian hordes of the steppes. And they could use it to help defend land and to signal towards the capital that barbarians were crossing at a certain part of the wall. Stonehenge. Stonehenge is these old rocks that got dragged several hundred miles from quarries, I believe in Wales, and set up in London, or not in London, but in England proper. And there are really multiple Stonehenges or hinges across Europe. We don't really know exactly what they were used for, but people, I think, are still amazed by them today because we don't really understand how they could have been built by the Stone Age peoples who built them. And we don't really know exactly what they were used for. There's some interesting theories. They may use as astrological devices, or I heard another theory where there used to be a wooden version, which was sort of signifying life, and the stone version, which I believe was supposed to signify death, which was very important. Obviously, the wood one would have dissolved when it lost its importance, but the big stone ones still stick around, and they're still an impressive sight. And from anyone who I've ever talked to who's visited them, there's something that you feel when you're around. Even today, the pyramids. For the longest time, these were the biggest structures on Earth for hundreds and hundreds of years. Well, really thousands and thousands of years. So impressive that I don't think they could have been built a few hundred years after they were because of changes in Egyptian culture. That sort of ability they had lost, and so they stopped building them, or potentially they stopped building them because they didn't consider it cost effective. And if you're trying to hide your treasure hoard, making a giant pyramid which says, hey, this is where I'm buried, probably wasn't the best idea. So for the Egyptians who built them originally as sort of this monument to last forever, that worked. However, all of the treasure from the inside, I believe, was taken from all of the pyramids, probably in antiquity. The Chunnel, and this is more of a modern one, but essentially it is where people can take the train or drive their car from England to France, which in and of itself doesn't sound that impressive, except for the English Channel, which is a giant part of the sea that crosses between them. And so they've developed this channel system, which allows ground transportation to move underneath the water to connect mainland Europe with England, which is a very interesting idea. And I don't know, especially with like the history of the French and the English, this definitely would not have been around 300 years ago. They would have seen it as a threat of war if someone had tried to tunnel to move land forces back and forth. But it's a magnificent piece of architecture that has been created today, which has probably made the lives of people a lot simpler who live and go back and forth today and can be overlooked. Wonders are not something that were built. They can come up and be created along the way too. Obviously, if they're man-made, that always happens. They get built, and from that point, they become important for a period of time. There are some other types of wonders you might want to consider for your world. One, and I think an important one, is massive geographic features like mountain ranges. The Rockies are imposing. The Andes are imposing. They're going to be very impactful, the people who live around them. The Amazon, the Nile, massive rivers, a lot of places where cultures first developed at. Even really broken terrain that sticks out in the area from the rest of the terrain that is common. Sort of going back to the Mount Fuji example a little bit, but it doesn't have to be quite that impressive. On a scale, it could be several mountains that sort of poke up by themselves in the middle of a plain. And if you don't understand why they're there, the culture is going to try and fill in that detail for themselves. And they're going to place a certain importance, whether it's good or bad, will be based on the culture. And if the mountains, let's say the 6 mountains that appear in the middle of the plain are exceptionally dangerous, it's probably something bad. And they're going to come up with stories to teach people through story that it's bad. And that's where wonders, especially natural wonders, become mythology early on. And beyond terrain features, you're also going to have to think about major states and their capitals, especially if they're strongly centrally controlled. Like in the world today, the United States, Washington, D.C. is probably a wonder because it has complete impact over everyone who's from the United States and over a lot of our allies and a lot of our enemies because of the way we use force across the world. So like the United States or not, Washington, D.C. probably has some influence over many, many cultures, which really makes it a wonder, even though we traditionally do not think of cities as a wonder. They might have wonders inside them, like the great library in Alexandria or the lighthouse in Alexandria, or in Rhodes they had the giant colossus built in the harbor. We don't necessarily think of them as wonders, but sometimes the entire city is like Rome definitely was. Beijing, Peking definitely was. Edo, Tokyo for the Japanese culture, definitely. Thebes for thousands of years, Alexandria. There are certain cities that have exuded influence that goes throughout their entire culture or even beyond. And sometimes even if you have a wonder in your world, like Washington, D.C. for your country, there might still be other major cities like Paris or Istanbul that also stick out. The major thing to keep in mind for the wonders that you want to talk about when you're building cultures or you're building countries is the level of influence. If it influences at least one culture and at a period of time people who come to visit, it should be considered a wonder. A point of interest, a major point of interest is really what I consider a wonder. It's not going to be something like MoMA or other museums. Those are important places to visit, but they don't have a true impact over the entire culture. However, other things on economic level, on a political level can. And the other thing to remember is over time, these things change. For example, the Connecticut River is a wide, deep channel river. It was very important even in the United States, while we were building big wooden ships, you could sail them up several miles to Middletown. I don't know if they could get all the way up to the capital of Hartford or not, but it's a very important river. It's tough to cross. You need to either build bridges, which are expensive because it's pretty wide, or you need to have ferries set up. So it's an obstacle. If I lived 1 mile from someone straight across the Connecticut River 200 years ago, it would be really difficult to get to them. 300 even more difficult. You're not swimming the Connecticut River, at least not effectively. However, it fades very quickly as more bridges get built. And where it's still a pretty impressive river, it's small. No one knows the connected river. It's not like the Mississippi or the Nile or the Amazon that are so massive that they stick out even today. But even things that you wouldn't think would be major could be based off the technological or magical limitations of the cultures in the world that you're working in. That is essentially all there really is to wonders, is finding these major points of interest that will influence the development of the cultures you're talking about. So whenever you're developing a culture or a country, you have to think, what are the wonders that are going to influence them, if any? There isn't always a wonder everywhere. If it was everywhere, then they wouldn't be a wonder. Now, the rating for this episode, this is an intermediate exercise, I think. You don't necessarily have to think about it because, like I said, there are not wonders everywhere. There are not wonders everywhere. So you don't necessarily have to have wonder discussion when you're building a culture. Just understand that if you don't have one and you don't have this impactful thing, and later on you want to add one, why has it never been noticed? Why has it never been important until this point of the stories that you're telling? Maybe it's because they've traveled somewhere into a different culture or a different country. Maybe it's something that's been built. Or maybe it's something that used to be really important and is now more of a tourist site. The world building task for the day is list the main culture's wonders. So whatever work in progress you are currently working on, whether it's a story, a video game, go through and list some wonders of that culture. And if there isn't really any for that specific culture, think about your world in a little bit larger scale and say, where are my Great Barrier Reefs? Do I have this sort of interaction that causes the Aurora Borealis style effect in my atmosphere? Is it bigger? Is it smaller? What are great architectural feats of the time I'm working in? These are going to be impressive. Now, the real world task for the day. If you start a simple task, finish it. And the reason I say this is sometimes it's very easy to sit there and go, oh, I have to go do this task. Let me grab a few things. Oh, wait, I forgot something. Let me sit down and I'll work on my world. I'll work on a story for a little bit and I get back to it. The reason you don't want to do that is because you're going to forget. Well, if you're like me, you're going to forget. You might not forget, but you have a risk to forget. So if you're doing something simple and just take a couple extra minutes to finish it up if you've forgotten something. And if you haven't forgotten something, great. You'll be done quickly and then you can move on to more world building tasks. The tease. The tease for this episode is cultures. My next episode goes into cultures. I'm shifting away from geography for a bit, going into one of my favorite subjects, and I really look forward to it. And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at Gardul.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike while the myth rolls high.